Welcome back to Unfair Housing. I'm Alicia Magazoo, and I'll be joined today by my colleagues Morgan Cardinal and Alec Rose. Our discussions in this episode will cover the development of public housing in the United States and how it was used to further housing segregation across the country. But first, we'll take a look at how formerly enslaved Black Americans adapted to their new lives following the Civil War and how the government and white America reacted. As a reminder, this podcast is not meant to be an exhaustive discussion on the history of housing segregation and housing discrimination, nor is it meant to create division or instill guilt, but rather to educate our listeners on what shaped our neighborhoods and our social perspectives so we can be better guided in our efforts to improve our future and avoid repeating the mistakes of our past. As always, remember, discrimination is a heavy topic, so please take care throughout this journey and pause the episode to take a breath if needed. Also, we welcome comments and lively discussion on the topics we raise, but we ask that kindness and consideration be used when making and responding to comments, and that you refrain from using threatening or violent language. All right, let's start by discussing the Great Migration, which occurred from around 1910 to the 1970s, when many Black Southerners moved to the north and west of the United States in search of economic freedom and to escape racially motivated violence. As discussed in the prologue episode, following the end of the Civil War and the Supreme Court decision in Plessy v. Ferguson, Southern states began passing laws that severely restricted the mobility and economic advancement of Black Southerners through the passage of Jim Crow laws. As the Great Migration got underway, northern and midwestern cities such as New York and Chicago saw a significant increase in their Black population, particularly around the beginning of World War I, as white industrial workers were sent off to war, leaving their jobs vacant. This change in circumstance created by the war and government restrictions on immigration gave Black Americans an opportunity to move out of jobs previously reserved for Black workers, such as jobs in agriculture in the South, and into these vacant industrial positions in the North and West. But for those who were able to migrate to other areas of the country, they didn't find a warm welcome in their new communities. The tactics we've discussed so far were used in all parts of the country to keep housing segregated by race. As we heard previously, zoning was a tool used for that purpose. Let's take a look at Baltimore as a northern example of racially discriminatory zoning law. In 1910, the city of Baltimore implemented an ordinance that banned Black people from moving to a block where more than half the residents were white, and also banned white people from moving to a block that was already majority Black. As you may recall, the Baltimore ordinance was very similar to the ordinance we discussed in episode 1, passed by the city of Louisville in 1914. Over time, the Baltimore ordinance created practical problems. For instance, the ordinance made it so a Black pastor couldn't live on his church's property because the block where the church was located had too many white residents, meaning since the block was already a majority white. Ultimately, the city of Baltimore revised its Black and white zoning ordinance to keep people of one race from moving to a neighborhood that was already completely occupied by the opposite race, a move that only furthered segregation. Unfortunately, these Black and white zoning ordinances were duplicated elsewhere in southern cities such as Atlanta, Miami, and New Orleans, until ultimately outlawed by the Supreme Court and the Louisville 1917 case Buchanan v. Worley. As we moved through the Great Depression following World War I and approached World War II, Black Americans migrating north again had access to jobs left vacant by white workers who went off to war, particularly in industries developing materials to support the war efforts. Around this time, the FDR administration turned its attention to the labor conditions of the American worker. To ensure fair labor standards for defense industry workers, the Labor Standards Act of 1938 was passed to provide workers with a minimum wage, eliminate child labor, and set a maximum work week of 44 hours. Now, this sounds like a significant advancement in how American workers were treated, but unfortunately, the law did nothing for the typical Black worker. To get the law passed, support was needed from southern states, so terms were included in the act to exempt protections for fields dominated by Black workers. This included the agriculture industry, domestic workers, and tipped workers, which meant no protections were in place to make sure these workers were not exploited, forced to work long hours in poor conditions for low pay. To put it bluntly, the Fair Labor Standards Act was yet another way the government kept Black Americans from equally participating in the American economic system and from building wealth. Further, the exemptions robbed many Southern Black children of an education. Because child labor was still allowed in the agriculture industry, many Black children were pulled from school to work in the fields, thus often never received higher than a 7th grade education. Black Americans didn't fare much better when it came to government housing during World War II either. To house defense industry workers, Congress passed the Lanham Act in October 1940, which financed housing for that population. Unfortunately, this program was also used to segregate housing. Some cities built housing only for white workers, forcing black workers to live in overcrowded areas, while other cities built housing that separated white lodging from black. Richmond, California, a city near San Francisco, is a great example. The city became a major site for defense equipment production during World War II. Using the Lanham Act, the city also became home to the largest war housing program. The housing built was segregated, with 2 projects set aside primarily for black and Mexican workers, and 4 projects reserved primarily for white workers. Once the war ended, so did the need for defense workers. Richmond city leaders voted to demolish the 2 housing projects inhabited primarily by black defense workers and evicted 700 families, leaving them with very few other options for housing. Over time, the other defense housing projects were demolished as well. Now, at this point, there had been fewer race-related outbursts in the West than in other areas of the country, say in the South and East. But the West Coast certainly had its issues too, particularly as the popularity of the KKK grew in California. We're about to get into a couple racially motivated incidents that were very reminiscent of Southern discriminatory behavior. A few years following the Supreme Court decision declaring restrictive covenants unconstitutional, Lieutenant Commander Sidney Hogan, a white Navy man who lived in an 800-home white suburb, thanks to restrictive covenants, in Rollingwood, California, listed his home for sale. Wilbur Gary, who was a Navy veteran and a building contractor, offered to buy the home because he and his family were about to be evicted due to demolition of their defense industry housing. As a solid middle-class family, the Garys should have been a welcomed addition to the neighborhood, but most of their neighbors did not agree. Why? Because the Garys were black. Rather than welcome the Garys to the neighborhood, they set a KKK cross on fire in the Garys' yard. For days they shouted racial threats while gathered outside the Garys' home, and they hurled bricks at the house and at the real estate office that negotiated the sale, breaking a window at both locations. Just like with the Myers, who we learned about last episode, law enforcement did little to nothing to stop the violence. It wasn't until California's governor and numerous activists urged the attorney general to get involved did law enforcement finally make some efforts to protect the family. But even then, the neighborhood opposition continued for another month, and no one was ever arrested. Once the neighborhood association got wind of the sale, they discouraged use of violence, but they still tried to get the Garys to leave by raising money to offer to purchase the home so harmony could be restored in the neighborhood. But the Garys refused. Despite the threat to their lives and their home, the Garys bravely stood their ground and refused to leave. As Wilbur Gary himself put it, "I'm not afraid and I will not be forced out. We've got to whip this thing sometime and it might as well be now." And later saying, "No price tag exists on my property in Rollingwood. I realize I'd be selling the rights of all minorities in America if I sold." The Garys' heroic stance helped spark a turning point in race relations. Supporters from all over came out in the hundreds to help defend the Garys. Wilbur and Bernice Gary are likely not names you're familiar with, but they should be heralded for their contributions to improving our democracy and fighting for equal justice for all. Their acts led to a citywide resolution banning segregation in public housing and provided proof democracy can overcome bigotry. While the Garys prevailed in their stand, many other families did not. A word of caution, the story I'm about to share may be difficult to hear. In 1945, Fontana, California, an unincorporated township just outside LA, it was understood black people lived north of Baseline Avenue and only white people lived to the south. Restrictive covenants helped keep this line in place, but not all areas were covered by a restrictive covenant separating the races. O'Day Short, a civil rights activist, found one of those areas south of Baseline Avenue and purchased a vacant piece of land with plans to build a home for his family. O'Day was a lighter-skinned black man, so it took time for all his neighbors, including the seller, to realize the shift in demographics. As word got out, threats began to mount, but this did not stop O'Day and his family from building their home in Fontana. As the threats came, O'Day notified law enforcement and the FBI, neither of which offered any protection. Local law enforcement instead encouraged the Shorts to leave to avoid harm. O'Day, a Mississippi native, assumed the threats to blow up his home were simply a tactic to scare his family away from the area. Since he was no longer in the South, he figured that kind of behavior would not occur in California. But as it turns out, Fontana was the landing spot for many who left the South in the 1930s to escape the Dust Bowl, a period of an extreme lack of rainfall and other factors that contributed to the economic hardships of the Great Depression. Thus, Fontana, California shared many similar views with O'Day's native Mississippi. On Sunday, December 16, 1945, O'Day stepped outside his half-built home to light a gas lamp. His family was still inside. Suddenly, there was an intense explosion, setting the entire structure on fire. O'Day bravely rescued his wife, 7-year-old daughter, and 8-year-old son from the burning home. But unfortunately, they all later died from their injuries. O'Day survived for about a month following the blast until the local district attorney bluntly informed him his entire family was killed by the blast, a fact that had not yet been shared with him during his recovery. O'Day died a few days later. Initially, the fire was ruled an accident caused by O'Day lighting the lamp, but witnesses of the event insisted otherwise. An investigation paid for by the National Association for the Advancement of Color People, also known as NAACP, revealed the fire was clearly intentionally set. Regardless, no criminal investigation was ever conducted and no one was ever held accountable. Today, an elementary school covers the site with no marker or recognition of what occurred there 80 years ago. Black families weren't kindly received in the North and Midwest either. We'll discuss Chicago in much more detail later, but the story of Harvey Clark, a World War II veteran, his wife Johnetta, and their 2 young children demonstrates the reception of Black Americans during the Great Migration in the Chicago area. In mid-1951, the Clarks moved from Mississippi to Cicero, an all-white suburb of Chicago. Their first attempt to move in was thwarted by the local sheriff, who refused to let them move in and threatened to arrest Harvey. The Clarks had to go to court to get an order requiring local law enforcement to allow the Clarks to move into the apartment, and the order also required local law enforcement to provide protection for the Clarks. Unfortunately, this order was ignored. The Clarks were eventually able to move in, but a firestorm of violence followed. Around 4,000 people swarmed the area, raided the apartment, and threw the family's belongings out the window, which were then set on fire, including Harvey's honorable discharge papers from the Air Force and the couple's marriage license. As historian Stephen Grant Meyer put it, it only took an hour to destroy what took a family 9 years to build. The Clarks' hard work to build a family, a life, and a home should have paid off for them, but it didn't, simply because they weren't white. The next day, the mob returned to throw rocks and bricks at the building, overturned police cars, then set off a bomb which burned down the entire 20-unit building. Cicero police officers did nothing to the mob, and so the governor stepped in and deployed the National Guard. In the end, 118 rioters were arrested, but none of them were indicted. Instead, Harvey Clark, along with his real estate agent who helped him rent the apartment, and the white landlady and her attorney, were all indicted by a grand jury for inciting a riot and conspiring to lower property values in the area. Fortunately, the charges were later dropped. But disturbingly, 36 years passed before another Black family attempted to move to Cicero. Even more disturbingly, that family was run out by firebombs and gunshots. Elsewhere throughout the North and Midwest, similar events occurred. Following World War II, Detroit, Michigan experienced over 200 acts of violence against Black Americans migrating to the city. In 1955 Philadelphia, there were also more than 200 incidents of violence meant to keep Black families from moving into white neighborhoods. So far, we've made several mentions of how the government and the housing industry interfered with housing integration, but now you're starting to see the role neighborhood behavior played. Unfortunately, these stories are not reserved to the West, North, and Midwest, so be sure to tune in to future episodes to learn about how the South reacted to Black families that attempted to break through racial segregation barriers in housing. But for now, we'll take a short break. When we return, Morgan will tell us about another government housing program that both led to housing segregation and created a significant stock of poorly constructed and poorly maintained housing.
Hey there, Alec here. We hope you're enjoying the Unfair Housing podcast so far. Thank you for joining us, and remember, if you or someone you know is experiencing housing discrimination, or if you'd like to schedule fair housing training, contact our Fair Housing Unit at 800-875-8785. To see if you qualify for other legal assistance, contact the CLS helpline at 800-405-1417. And don't forget to give us a like and follow. And please share the series with your friends and family. Also, be sure to follow CLS on Instagram, Facebook, and X.
Welcome back. We've been discussing the Great Migration and what Black Americans moving from the South to other areas of the country faced from neighbors in their new communities. Now we're going to delve into what the government did to address the housing shortage following World War II and what impact that had on housing segregation. As part of the package of programs created under the New Deal, we heard about the PWA, the Public Works Administration, in episode 2. As a reminder, FDR created the PWA, which operated from 1933 through 1939 as a government agency designed to reduce unemployment and increase citizens' purchasing power through the development of a highway system and public buildings. This included addressing the third housing issue created by the Great Depression, a housing shortage. During PWA's existence, it spent about $4 billion, that's billion with a B, equaling nearly $31 billion in today's money. These funds were used to create more than 70% of the nation's education buildings, 65% of its courthouses, city halls, sewage disposal plants, and 35% of all public health facilities, and another 10% of new roads, bridges, and subways. One area of focus for the PWA was the creation of the public housing agencies, also known as PHAs, located across the country. Local governments that chose to have PHAs received funding from the federal government to develop rental housing. Local governments also had the right to establish rules and regulations for this housing, which meant they could determine who could and could not live in the government-funded housing. Despite the housing project being directed by Harold Ickes, Secretary of the Interior for FDR, and former president of the NAACP, public housing built through this program remained segregated. The program developed 47 projects, of which 17 were for Black tenants alone. 6 segregated white and Black tenants by housing the races in different buildings with separate entrances, and the remaining 24 projects were for whites only. Ickes implemented a neighborhood composition rule when developing the properties through the PWA project, which required the projects meet the current demographic makeup of a neighborhood. Public housing was also used to segregate previously integrated neighborhoods, which had been naturally created when workers of mixed races moved closer to their work. For example, in 1935, a mixed-race, low-income neighborhood called Tanier Bottom in northwest Atlanta near Georgia Tech's campus was demolished under a program originally put forth by the Herbert Hoover administration and later approved by the FDR administration. The neighborhood was primarily made up of workers who were employed in the manufacturing and warehouse districts located nearby. The slum, as it was termed, was viewed as a drain on property values in the area. Local businesses and interested parties, led by real estate agent Charles Palmer, lobbied for funding to demolish the integrated neighborhood with hopes of developing a new neighborhood that would boost their property values. So Tanier Bottom was acquired by the federal government through the PWA, and the neighborhood was raised to make way for the country's first government-funded and owned housing project, Techwood Homes. Over 1,600 families were displaced, many of them Black families. The homes were replaced by PWA buildings, playgrounds, and open space, all of which were built for lower middle-income whites. An interesting fact considering Ickes' neighborhood composition rule, if implemented in this instance, would have resulted in a mixed-race project. When first built, Techwood Homes was a model public housing project. The buildings were designed with fireproof brick, a feature that slums throughout the country were without, and they included modern appliances and closets in each of the rooms. The price of rent incorporated heat, electricity, and water. Further, residents had access to playgrounds, administrative offices, stores, and a health clinic. This property became a source of pride for the community, though apartments only covered a quarter of the original grounds, allowing for only 600 families to reside at Techwood Homes. This is compared to the 1,600 families displaced from Tanyard Bottom to make way for Techwood Homes. Tanyard Bottom was not the only neighborhood dubbed the slums and targeted by Charles Palmer. Many other low-income neighborhoods in Atlanta, such as Beaver Slide, were demolished under FDR's New Deal program. As the PWA began to phase out, the United States Housing Authority took over PWA projects in 1939. USHA, as it was known, created its own impact on housing segregation. Alec, can you tell us about the USHA?
Sure, Morgan. The United States Housing Authority was established by the National Housing Act of 1937 and provided loans to PHAs to build public housing. Unlike the PWA, the USHA did not actively participate in the development of housing or the destruction of less desirable neighborhoods. Under the National Housing Act, local PHAs were handed that responsibility. Local governments and public preferences were supposed to guide public housing development. The USHA simply funded the projects, provided administrative assistance, and pressed the importance of using USHA loans to clear out the slums and ensure low-income housing was safe, sanitary, and would lead to a reduction in unemployment. The USHA required local public housing authorities to follow many guidelines, including design and construction, resident applications, and property management. The physical public housing buildings were owned by the local agencies. It was also expected that the local housing agencies would establish low-income housing programs and clean up and remove the slums within their cities. This would allow communities to decide who is renting or buying their homes. Local PHAs were required to replace or repair one unit of public housing determined to be unsafe or unsanitary for each new unit developed. In doing so, the quality of the public housing increased, but the number of available units remained the same. Moreover, the replacement and repair could be deferred if there was a significant housing shortage. This deferment would be permitted until the housing shortage was found to have decreased, meaning, overall, improvement of public housing unit quality was not guaranteed. Because of how the policies of the Housing Act of 1937 were designed, the existing racial patterns essentially determined that housing would be designated based on racial identities. Thus, the creation of the USHA furthered racial segregation and at the same time empowered communities to further racial divisions. If a community did decide to build public housing, they could decide to build it in an all-white neighborhood to ensure that it was available to low-income white families only. The USHA manual also instructed local housing authorities to segregate Americans, stating that it was not favorable to have white-only housing in black neighborhoods. Further, the manual stated that local PHAs should not try and disrupt the status quo, but instead preserve the community as it is. While the USHA was intended to create housing, instead it faced pushback from critics. The most outspoken opponents of public housing were members and actors of the private housing construction industry, who saw the USHA as a threat not only to their profits, but also to the cherished ideal of home ownership. They further argued that public housing would promote communism and lead to the decline of America. Homeowners from neighborhoods where public housing was planned for development became convinced that real estate values would decline and communists would move into the neighborhood, so they joined campaigns to stop public housing initiatives altogether. So what impact did the pushback have on public housing? Well, harsh construction cost restrictions were added to the Housing Act of 1937 by the opponents of public housing. To comply, the USHA and local housing authorities were forced to decrease the size of dwelling units and eliminate non-essentials, such as closet doors, increase overall project density, and trim community facilities that were supposed to help integrate the developments into larger urban communities. In February 1942, FDR made the decision to reduce the number of available housing programs and ordered the merging of over a dozen other federal housing agencies into the National Housing Agency. With that decision, the USHA, after operating for only 5 years, was abolished, and its activities were transferred to the National Housing Agency's Federal Public Housing Authority. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Morgan to talk about some local examples of housing segregation in Central Florida.
Thanks, Alec. As we've heard, the funding for public housing was insufficient, particularly after middle-class white tenants moved to the suburbs. The federal government placed caps on how much money could be spent per room, which essentially discouraged use of quality materials. The buildings were often poorly maintained once built as well, partly due to poor funding. Annual funding for public housing was limited to the difference between operational expenses and rent. Because rent decreased as more middle-income tenants moved out, rent revenue was minimal at best. Maintenance costs were the responsibility of local governments, which rent revenue was also insufficient to cover. So there was very little incentive for local governments to invest in public housing or to keep the buildings properly maintained. As a result, a vast majority of the public housing stock became categorically uninhabitable over time. Yet tenants were stuck living in these conditions with nowhere else to go. So public housing slums replaced the very slumlord properties they demolished. Further, public housing concentrated poverty by kicking out tenants once their income reached a certain threshold. Local examples here in the city of Orlando are the stories of Jonestown and the neighborhood of Paramore. The stories of these historic communities are intertwined, as each has experienced the various negative impacts of segregation. As part of the Reconstruction era, you can check out our prologue episode for more on this time period. Formerly enslaved people founded Orlando's first African-American neighborhood during the 1880s. Sam Jones and his wife Penny settled along the banks of Fern Creek, about a mile east of Orlando's downtown, establishing Jonestown. Railroad tracks laid in Orlando divided the city into black communities on the west and predominantly white neighborhoods on the east. Remember, Jonestown was established on the east side of Orlando. The Black Americans on the west side eventually established what we now know as the Paramore neighborhood. This community, like Jonestown, would thrive well into the 20th century. In the 1930s, a house in Jonestown occupied by a black family burned down. But when work began on rebuilding it, a delegation of white residents residing in all white communities surrounding Jonestown protested to city officials, citing the poor condition of neighboring structures. The city withdrew the building permit, and eventually Orlando officials would demolish a portion of Jonestown in order to create the whites-only public housing development, Reeves Terrace. Officials seemed to hold out hope that the residents of Jonestown would just move to the Griffin Park Public Housing Project, a blacks-only housing project on the west side of town. Griffin Park was established on September 8, 1940, in the Paramore neighborhood. By 1951, the bustling Jonestown community no longer existed. The once bustling middle-class neighborhood of Paramore struggled through the development of two major highway systems, State Road 408 and Interstate 4. Interstate 4 was constructed in 1964 and largely follows the path of the railroad that originally cut Orlando into two communities. But more on this in a future episode. Griffin Park is an example of a shared experience of low-income minority communities and public housing throughout the U.S. The PHA funds allocated under the PWA and later by the USHA were limited to initial construction and were often insufficient for ongoing maintenance issues. In the 1960s, changes to PHA policies only made things worse. Congress raised the rent cap to 30% of household income, increasing the rent for people who worked. This drove the working class into the private market, which solidified PHA properties as a last resort for housing reserved exclusively for the poorest of the poor. Instead of allocating additional funding to allow rehabilitation of existing PHA properties, the federal government sought to privatize public housing in the 1970s. The federal government turned toward voucher programs and private management companies, reducing the power of the public housing authorities. Public housing residents found themselves displaced and at the mercy of the private market that often resulted in discriminatory housing practices, forcing former public housing residents into areas of high poverty and segregation. Today's episode tells the story of separate but very unequal housing experiences of Black and white Americans. Public housing was often segregated with few options available to low-income Black renters, and the public housing options that were available were often poorly maintained. We also learned Black families that did have the means to purchase homes in white suburbia were forced out through threats and violence, which resulted in broadening the wealth gap even more between Black and white Americans. Thanks for joining us this week. We look forward to having you join us next week as we delve into the specific federal programs implemented to prioritize homeownership of some, but not all, American homebuyers. We'll see you then.